Hi, this is Paul. I haven't made a video like this for 2 weeks or so, so it's well due, but it's just been busy. The fence is underway, and lots of other stuff going on. Just got beyond Easter, and there's so much Peugeot material out there that I want to engage with, but because there's so much of it, I want to sort of make the landscape for it because it's hard to map it otherwise. And I'm not going to be able to get everything through everything now. One of the ways to get at it was through this tweet by Susanna Black. Listen to an episode of Wet Brain. Never heard of any of these people. I listened to the same episode, about half of it. I hadn't heard of any of those people either, but I found it fascinating. Links below. Because of the Vanity Fair article. And I thought, I didn't know that article either. I don't know. Seems like Jesus gets people into all different kinds of ways. Seems like Jesus gets people in all different kinds of ways, and getting them because it's hip and reactionary to go to church can eventually become real. I thought, well, that's interesting. They also just sounded a lot like very early Christians and very young people flailing about. Every generation of young adults converts has its phase. You're kind of a jellyfish of chaos with a real self, but a lot of accretions and stupid ideas and no good boundaries and no spine, which can coexist with being too rigid and judgmental and hard on yourself and others. And then when you become a Christian, Jesus just starts patiently giving you a real skeleton, a real shape to help that self of yours really be itself. It's more restful and sane to be a mature Christian in the same way that it's easier to live in a body that has a strong core muscles and doesn't have like chiropractic problems. Gosh, though, conversion was hard enough without having a podcast during it. Strong recommendations that people not produce content while converting. I wrote a master's thesis while I was converting, and it was the worst for that. I tried to evangelize my advisor in the text of the thesis. It was still good academic work. It just had some lines that didn't need to be there. So then I responded to her, and because I wanted to know what Vanity Fair article. Let's see if I can find. Is it down below? Twitter, what are you doing? Give it to me here. Okay, so here was the Vanity Fair article. Inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. They're not MAGA, they're not QAnon. Curtis Yarvin and the rising right are crafting a different strain of conservative politics by James Pogue. It was a very interesting read. I had a lot of fun reading it. And of course, I bumped into Yarvin before. One of the videos that continues to get traffic long after I did it is basically why the left keeps winning, and where I was responding to a video by the distributist. And so that put me back into thinking a little bit about Curtis Yarvin and Mencius Moldbug, which I don't know a terribly lot about. But this whole piece talking about Curtis Yarvin's Cathedral, and in some ways, not all, it sort of matches up with Paul Kingsnorth. Now, Paul Kingsnorth both had a good conversation with Jonathan Peugeot and a Rebel Wisdom talk with Mary Harrington, both of which I thought were quite good. Right now there's like 20 hours of YouTube content I would love to do conversation on. But what generally happens is 1 hour of YouTube content produces 3 hours of PVK commentary, and I currently don't have 60 hours to pour into this. So I have to frame it and get a handle on it. And lo and behold, what comes up in my feed but Curtis Yarvin on the stoa? And it's like, hey, I know these stoa guys. Let's see where this goes. And I've listened to him on a variety of things over the years on YouTube. And sometimes I don't find him very coherent, but I found him particularly coherent in this, maybe because I'm more familiar with the stoa types and them in this little corner of the internet. So let's give it a go.
There may be some noise, and I will be ready to begin. Thank you so much for having me on here.
Cool. So a few people, when they found out that you were coming, they're like, "Wow, you got Curtis Yarvin," and some people were upset. So
Hmm.
I was like, I did something naughty or something having you on. And so this might
Indeed.
set up the conversation on the cathedral, but I'm curious, why do you think there's a sense of controversy surrounding you?
Um, Gosh, why I think there's a sense of controversy surrounding me. I've never really been asked that question before. I think that people. Let me take a moment to answer this. I think people overrate, in many ways, their relevance and importance, and in of specifically their political participation in the world. I think that most people feel a sort of great sense of importance from kind of mattering in a sense, even though I would assert that that sense is mostly sort of has a kind of pornographic quality in terms of their participation in the political world. I think very few people matter at all, and not much in the way that we think. And so,
Now, I found right off the bat, I found this point very interesting because, of course, it makes sense in a political sphere. But if you think about the fact that politics has become religion, in the same way that Christians, let's say, via their imaginations, participate in a Christ infused world. Now, when I say via their imaginations, I don't mean that disparagingly at all, because in fact, we have to use our imaginations and the arena that we live within, one that is proximal to us and one that is meaningful for us to really engage with, is done via our imagination. I think Yarvin has a tremendous point here that for many people, the political arena has become, he doesn't say it this way, but the point has been made by many others, has become their religious arena. And so they overplay their hand, just because they've gone to bat on Facebook or Twitter for their knights and heroes out there. And just because they are mooking it up, they see that as terribly instrumental and consequential. And I think, in a way, not unlike the way Christians imagine they are out there prevailing for Christ in one way or another, too. This is simply a function of the agent arena relationship. And in many ways, we participate in this via our imaginations. We have to fill it in to understand the importance for it to be meaningful. And again, when I say it happens via our imaginations, I don't mean that in a delusional way. That, in fact, one way that we use the word imaginary is just dismissively. But I don't mean it that way. I think when we are thinking about how our actions and conversations happen, let's say in the context of a family or a household or an office environment, we use our imaginations to participate, to sort of create the arena, the meaningful arena populated with all of the individuals with whom we are interacting imaginatively to do that. And the point he's making here is that this is what people are doing politically, and because they go out and they retweet from their favorite liberal or conservative politician or pundit, they suddenly feel like their tweet is full of meaning. And he's basically saying, probably it's a little overblown.
when you give people the idea that either the way in which they matter could be or should be taken away, or that they don't matter that much, or that the things they believe are actually harmful in some sense, you know, they tend to react as if you'd stolen their puppy.
Now, in this little corner of the internet, we've done a fair amount of assessment of propositional belief as such. And I think there are two errors we can make with respect to propositional belief. One is to push it too hard, and one is to not respect it enough. The whole point is that believing in fact does matter, because believing is at least a quarter of what's going on here. The propositions that you hold do matter because they finally will inform and influence all of the other ways that you participate in this imaginary sphere with others in order to achieve meaningful progress in the arena as you conceive it.
And I don't steal anyone's puppy. I'm not a puppy stealer, but you know, I understand that reaction, and I sort of feel a little bit sad about it, I guess. But you know what? The dogs bark and the caravan moves on. I don't know.
And so the cathedral concept, I think you wrote about it in 2008.
Something like that, yes.
And in your recent piece in Gray Mirror, you described it as basically journalism plus academia, all the intellectual institutions at the center, at the heart of modern society, sort of like how the church was, but now it leans progressive and woke.
And it's decentralized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like the mystery. Like a lot of people have
This has one level upness written all over it throughout this conversation.
By a conspiratorial narrative, but like, how do all these prestigious institutions, even though they have no central organizing authority, how are they having the same talking point and acting as if they are? And so for people who are just being onboarded to this, anything else you think would be good to add to that?
No, I think that's really the central mystery. The central mystery is why we have all of these people sort of trust these institutions because of their polycentric nature. And yet you don't see them drifting apart from each other in any sense. You see them drifting only closer and closer together. So Harvard does not move right while the Yale moves left. The Washington Post does not move right while the New York Times moves left. They're all drifting over time. They're all drifting in the same direction, and they're all just drifting sort of closer and closer to us, to each other. It's sort of like, you know, people assumed when they first kind of got really powerful telescopes and looked at astronomy that you know, all the galaxies were just kind of moving around randomly, and then they realized, whoa, they're actually like all moving away from us. And this, you know, sort of the explanation of this kind of surprising order led to the theory of the Big Bang. And so the theory of basically why this marketplace of ideas tends to basically converge to such a point that the sort of they converge into a little bubble which is constantly shrinking, and perspectives far from sort of new perspectives being discovered, perspectives which were formerly acceptable tend to disappear from the bubble until it sort of converges into this tiny sort of point of light. And some of these theories, some of the ways of thinking within the bubble are very they're very, like, they would seem very strange to a person coming from 50 years ago. Of course, we would say that person, or people within the bubble would say that person had sort of yet to learn a certain amount of information. And so, you know, one possibility that has to be considered is that these are all converging for the same reason that we're all converging on the fact that water is H2O, or that, you know, sort of converging in the sense that science converges. And that's clearly the metaphor that the whole of academia wants us to operate on, but it doesn't seem like the sort of the consensus is this strong. And so the question is basically, if there are things that are driving that consensus that is not driving it toward the truth, what are the forces and factors involved, and why is this happening?
And again, I think very interesting points that these things are not static, they are moving. Now, bubbles are interesting because, in a sense, all of us are a bubble of one, but then we sort of form a bubble together. And again, part of what we're seeing right now is that bubbling together is a part of what we do. More Christ now has 2 conversations with me in the can that he hasn't shared yet. But one of the conversation I had this morning was with Jan Zimmerman, who teaches at Regent in Vancouver, and Marcos of More Christ, you know, basically wanted to put us together and asked if I'd be willing. I said sure, partly because I mentioned Bonhoeffer when I was talking to Andrew Root. So then in preparation for that, I listened to this video of his on Christian humanism, And this little segment of persons and the Trinity really caught my attention.
Without these elements, we would never have arrived at the modern idea of the person. And because of these elements, we may venture the exaggeration that Christianity invented personhood. And, Andrew Kettler's favorite theologian, Ratzinger, is one of the ones who says that quite often, as does Hans Urs von Balthasar. So with those two authorities firmly cemented, we'll move on. So first, the notion of the person as we know it today arose from the early Christian discussions about the Trinitarian relation of Father, Son, and Spirit, and then during the Christological debates that the notion of the person first took shape. For example, the Trinity was defined as three hypostases or manifestations, personal manifestations of a shared divine nature. This definition first gave rise to the idea of a person as a unique someone who expresses in particular ways as a shared nature, but who can never be reduced to this nature.
And when you think about that sharedness, and when you think about the bubbles, now that's where you really get the sense of the fact that what these collective persons are that we are making, and they're not fully persons. You almost get this sense in Tolkien where Sauron isn't quite able to take embodied form yet, but his person is sort of distributed amongst the orcs and with the eye and with all of these. You kind of get the sense that these bubbles can't form together, but of course the bubble dynamics is very much part of the back and forth reality of the agent and the arena working together, and so you'll get some sense of limited personhood and agency, not fully constituted personhood, but distributed personhood and agency in these dynamics as we're trying to make our way into the future and talk with one another.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And a lot's happened since 2008, like Trump, COVID, Ukraine, a bunch of current things. Anything that surprised you that made you modify this model of the cathedral?
No. I mean, there were sort of interesting, there were very, COVID especially had some very interesting sort of twists and turns, which kind of let you see some of these forces at work. You might remember the flip in early 2020, where in February of 2020, we were all supposed to go out and lick doorknobs and not care about the coronavirus. And then Donald Trump decided that he also did not care about the coronavirus, which resulted in a sort of complete flipperoo. I think that if Trump had gone sort of full COVID hardliner and been like, we have to preserve our precious bodily fluids, from this evil Chinese disease, and then we would still be being asked to lick doorknobs. And
he made this point, and one should remember, it's amazing how little memory this collective person that people are participating with doesn't have. Because, of course, remember when Trump sort of closed the border to China, everybody freaked out. And it was like, oh, you're overreacting. But then, of course, now the other side would take on their own freak-outery. And he has a real point here that a lot of what's going on is in fact transjective in nature, and you sort of have bubbles watching bubbles,
and so what you see is that the forces acting, sort of anything like that sort of gets you a picture of the forces that are driving the consensus in one direction or another. And those forces don't necessarily, we have this abstract model of we understand when we look at this system that prestigious ideas govern the world, essentially, and the world has to be governed according to prestigious ideas and non-prestigious ideas. And if we imagine those prestigious ideas to be
and that's pretty important, because when he's saying prestigious ideas, he's basically saying ideas have status too, and part of the bubbling is that we all agree again on these beliefs and these propositional beliefs.
Generated by a marketplace of ideas which selects entirely for good ideas, then it's very simple to explain this behavior, which is that we found the best ideas, and the ideas keep getting better and keep getting righter, and we keep converging on a truer and truer truth. And the sense that, at a certain point, you either have to
what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery.
Really, really believe that. And to really, really believe that, you have to really ignore some really strange stuff that's going on. But the car dealer is calling me. But to accept that, you have to believe some really, really hard to believe stuff. But the idea that basically this marketplace of ideas is not optimizing for truth, justice, beauty, whatever, is sort of like, well, what would that even mean? Because these people are very, very smart. They're generally smart and well-intentioned. How are they, if they are systematically wrong in this way, what is causing that, and how does that phenomenon work? And the thing is that basically I try to explain that, I think it's very important to explain that phenomenon in a way that sort of drives people away either from the illusion of kind of centralized, there are networks that are sort of a little bit centralized-ish, but they sort of don't really modify the fundamental conclusion. You want to push the sort of the thinking of this away from something like a centralized network. You want to push it away from the kind of military thinking that sort of assumes like the collective malice of the enemy. And and sort of just analyze this system, not to sort of fight it really, but just to understand how it works. It has like certain flaws like every other way of getting along that's ever been devised. And
now what's interesting when he's talking about it here, you see very much the modernist language. Well, it's a system. Okay. Well, what exactly is a system? And why are we using all of these, why are we personifying it in the way that we're doing?
Let's understand this and sort of see what the fundamental flaws in the model are, and then determine how it can be fixed.
Even a model, it's almost like, well, data goes in and different data comes out. It's very static, very machine-like. And again, part of the reason why I wanted to start with this is because I still have my eyes on the Peugeot Weinstein conversation, which is a long one. But to tip my hand a little bit, for Bret Weinstein, he imagines that people are in charge of this world. And even with a little bit of thinking, you'd notice, no, people are not in charge of this world. Putin is not in charge of this world. Biden is not in charge of this world. The United States Congress is not in charge in this world. There's no individual person that is in charge of this world. And then people sort of then think about conspiracies. Well, maybe Biden and a few other captains of industry or thought leaders or Hollywood people, they're in charge of this world, not realizing that once in fact you have a committee, once you have a group of people, those people are going to, in some ways, level up into a spiritual entity of sorts, an angel or a spirit or something like that. And this cohort is in charge of the world. And no, they are not. There's no such thing. The Illuminati, Biden, deep state. You can think about all of these things. And then we sort of leap in our modern mind to, well, a system is in charge of this. Well, tell me about this system. Does it have agency? Does it have consciousness? How does it have agency? How does it have consciousness? You sort of call it a system, and then maybe you give it an abstract name like the Cathedral or the Machine or the Blob or the Blue Church, something like that. But notice what you've done. You've basically made a a person of sorts. And once again, back to Pascal and the spirit of finesse and the spirit of geometry, whenever we look up, we apply the spirit of finesse. Just like we do when we look across at another person. We apply the spirit of finesse. If you approach your wife with the spirit of geometry, results will not be favorable to you. To a degree, you can approach your child with the spirit of geometry, because in fact we use the spirit of geometry down, but we use the spirit of finesse up and across, because that's how you deal with persons, and persons are complex.
So yeah, anyone feel free to put your question in the chat. I'll ask Curtis one more question, and you can ask him whatever you want. Really, it doesn't have to be on the topic of the cathedral. And the last question is, it might sound like a little bit of a circling, authentic relating question. I know you're dunking on that in your blog post, but I'm curious how the cathedral sees you, or how you think the cathedral sees you.
Now notice, we talk about the cathedral as if it can see him. Well, what does seeing involve? Now, because of all the cognitive science, we know that seeing isn't just putting a camera on him, or maybe having Google or AT&T or Verizon track him via his cell phone. It's a much deeper seeing that has meaning. And again, all the way back to, which Jordan Peterson video was it, where he's talking about the fact that meaning precedes object recognition. Oh, that was his talk with Sam Harris. The cathedral sees you. Well, you don't mean that there's a committee meeting and it's Curtis Yarvin and they're passing all papers around. What do we think about him? The cathedral sees you. And even when people do that, the cathedral then colonizes the individual people around that table, and they start seeing him together. And so there's a distributed consciousness that sort of takes over and goes with that.
Like academics or journalists studying your work have seen you. Where have you felt seen by that? Where did you feel like they missed the mark?
Now we're felt seen. Oh, it's that hyperactive agency detector that all the new atheists are talking about.
Well, I can't really answer very much, because I really don't like looking at responses. Like a lot of writers, I really don't like looking at responses to my own work.
I'm not going to think about being seen by the cathedral.
There was a piece in Tablet on me recently. I'm told it's fairly good. I haven't read it. There was a piece by me in Tablet.
There's a piece about you in Vanity Fair that is very much written by the cathedral.
Accompanying it, which I also don't read my own work after I read it, so I haven't read this either. Right. So
man after my own heart. Not a recommendation I make, but I totally understand it.
I tend to be a write and forget kind of guy. That's just a literary dysfunction, really. But yeah, I would say that, like, when you see, I mean, there's a sort of number of ways of considering the problem. Generally, what people do when they're inside a bubble, and that bubble is the whole world to them, is that they sort of pick a point outside the bubble, and that point outside the bubble becomes kind of a metonym for the world outside that bubble. So one of the ways,
because the world is too big to understand, and so this is in fact how we do it.
I like to explain this often, is the use of the word gentile. So if you're familiar with the word gentile, which means something actually different in Utah, which is great. I can go to Utah and be a Jewish Gentile. Gentile is a word that describes a negative set. So basically, a Gentile could be a Buddhist. He could be a Zoroastrian. He could be a Muslim. He could be, anything that's not a Mormon, or anything that's not a Jew. If you're in Israel, he could be a Hindu, right? And so the problem comes when you take a negative. It's a perfectly legitimate category in a sense, but when you take a negative category and you try to describe its characteristics, and so you say Gentiles are like this, based on looking like at a Hindu or something, and then you're just like, no, they're actually more like that. You just sort of get nonsense. You can't actually categorize the features of a negative set. except as sort of negative features. A Gentile is someone who doesn't believe in Mormonism, right? And so actually people who don't believe in Mormonism,
this is actually a really helpful point that he's making right here.
Believe in all kinds of different things. So when this is applied to the political system of the bubble, people sort of think in terms of a spectrum from left to right, but that spectrum is actually sort of coiled up. That is actually, for me, a spectrum of inside the bubble to outside the bubble. So as you go toward the right, the problem is that the variety of perspectives that you see increases and increases. And so you're basically like, everything outside this bubble is Hitler. You're not saying everything outside this bubble is Louis XIV, or everything outside this bubble is, the Venetian Republic, or everything outside this bubble is Bismarck's Prussia, or 1,000 other different examples. You're basically, and this is what it means to think in an essentially provincial way. When you're thinking in the bubble, one of the things you do is you ascribe wildly outsized importance to historical examples from the last 50 to 100 years. So you're looking at history itself through a fisheye lens. 12 years in Germany is more important than the whole 17th century. And so you kind of, even the things outside the bubble you see are in some ways distorted reflections of the bubble itself. I mean, Hitler, for example, is kind of a distorted reflection of liberalism in many ways. He's sort of kind of he's kind of antithetical to liberalism in the way that, say, Louis XIV or Elizabeth I is not. And so, even in the enemies of this system in the 20th century, you get this cramped smallness that sort of takes place around the edge of the bubble. And
that's why everyone is Hitler. Well, you're Hitler and you're Hitler. And you're just like, wait a minute, they're not even close to Hitler on any scale. If you have any understanding of Nazism, they might be evil. Mao is Hitler. So Mao isn't anywhere near Hitler. Is there a Venn diagram where Mao and Hitler could be in the same circle? Absolute. Dictators, totalitarians, et cetera, but that's not necessarily a helpful thing to chart.
And those examples tend to be bad ones. And so when you try to basically fit kind of thinking that is more broadly historical than this kind of 20th century bubble in this 20th century conflict, it's hard to fit it into your mind because you're convinced that the bubble is the whole world.
Right. All right, so let's pivot to Q&A. We got a bunch of questions in the chat. We'll go in order. And one follow-up question only. So,
sure.
Kaleem, you're up first. Or Kalim. You can just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, Curtis, how are you doing?
Good.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah, so my question is whether you think in your, writing and politics and engagement, you've been successfully consistent with your pacifist political strategy. And if so, then wouldn't, according to sort of your theory, you not be viewed as much as a threat by the Cathedral as you apparently are?
I've been only partially and intermittently successful. I think that many people who have been inspired by me have been much more successful. It's kind of impossible to avoid that role to some extent. And, when you read my old, blog posts, I slip more easily into a kind of, joyously confrontational state of mind than I do now. So, it's sort of, it's a mixed bag in some ways. And I certainly, I don't advise people who read my stuff to come out of the closet. I don't advise them to combine their sort of online and offline identities. I don't advise them to do a lot of different things that I did. And, but yeah, that's,
Which is very interesting because, and this will cross through a lot of the conversations. So the two conversations with Kingsnorth, you very much so here you have an environmental activist who has in some ways arguing that the movement has left him. The movement instead of, well, he says it right here.
Well, I suppose in my case, I use this word, the machine, all the time in the writing I'm doing at the moment. It's not my word. It's stolen from writers like D.H. Lawrence and George Orwell and Aldous Huxley and everyone else who was paying attention for the last 100 years. And I'm really talking about this giant techno-industrial monstrosity that is in our heads and in the world, which is really the project of modernity as far as I can see. And the project of modernity is to build a machine to replace God, because we've given up on God, and consequently we've given up on limits and living within the natural world and our place within that. And we've decided that through the use of technology, science and reason, we can effectively build a new world which doesn't seem to limit us in any way. And we've decided that any limits at all, whether they're the limits that our body provides or the limits that the natural world provides us with, or the limits of our behavior towards each other, are disgraceful chains that prevent us from being free and rational and individuals. And so I think it's just a...
Now this is where Kingsnorth and Yarvin are quite interesting, because now Yarvin is going to be a monarchist. Peugeot admitted to me he's a monarchist. And what I liked about Yarvin is Yarvin actually got into what this monarchism would look like. Now, in this conversation, this War and Reality with Mary Harrington and Paul Kingsnorth, they sort of ended it and said, well, this is sort of a diagnosis, and we're going to get to the prescription in the next one if we do another one, and I very much hope they do. But what's the relationship between the cathedral and the machine? Now, Yarvin will basically note that, well, conservatives have been frustrated with their conservative politicians because they don't actually accomplish what they want to. And then, of course, maybe Donald Trump came along perhaps with the hope that he would perhaps break the machine. So there's an interesting relationship between, let's say, Paul Kingsnorth, who takes on orthodoxy as this radical embrace of limits, and an idea that the machine has to be stopped. And Yarvin, who has some of those, but when Yarvin gets into his monarchism, he's going to appeal to precisely elements that Kingsnorth would say are parts of the problem.
A very big, very old way of seeing that is manifesting itself in silicon and plastic all around us. And as I say, coming at that from the perspective of an environmentalist, or a former one, what I saw was the green movement being entirely sucked into this way of seeing. And I became a greener years ago because I was entranced by the small is beautiful model that the Greens used to believe in the 70s. When I was a little boy, the world of E.F. Schumacher and Leopold Kohr and Gandhi and Tolstoy and everyone else who told us to live within natural limits in a way that would actually be nourishing.
See, and when Kingsnorth says that, I also very much connect with that, because this was sort of the wave that I was raised into. Small is beautiful. Christians in the age of Ron Sider's Christians in the age of hunger.
To us. And the Green Movement instead bought into this machine thinking in which it saw climate change and other issues as technological problems to be solved with more technology, all of which sucks us into the same project of busting down limits. So now environmentalism has become a question of how many wind farms you can get up and whether you should use nuclear power and GM crops and whether you should do X, Y, and Z.
It's also interesting because one of the things I think I'm going to have to do at some point is make sort of a map, because in this little corner of the internet, these are all sort of people that might say, okay, these people are this little quarter friendly. But Jordan Peterson is very much about technological solutions to environmental problems. So for Paul Kingsnorth, he would much more be sort of on the side of the machine. And when you look at Jonathan Peugeot and James Lindsay would very much be part of these classical liberals. And Yarvin, well, we're going to have to, again, do a little bit more in Yarvin. Let's hear a little bit more of this, and let's go back to the other.
To effectively create a, quote, sustainable limitless machine world. All paths kind of lead back to this modern way of seeing almost every question. I mean, Mary comes at this from as far as I can see, from the angle of, from the feminist angle. But as she says, it's the same question, actually. You can just approach it from all of your different sort of personal perspectives, and it all leads you back to this attitude we have to nature and human nature.
Now I want to drop into the end of the video here, because the point that David Fuller makes here, I think, is a really helpful one.
So I hope you enjoyed that. I really loved the conversation while I was part of it, and then I listened to it again afterwards and something really landed. So I'm going to try and explain why I think this is significant. Maybe you can let me know what you make of this in the comments. I think what this conversation is a moving towards a synthesis position between what you might call dissident right and dissident left. It's explaining how the extreme woke agenda is liquefying all structures, which is what the right is angry about, but Paul explains that ultimately this is in the interests of capital, and it's a corporate agenda, which is what the left is upset about. And it also validates the feelings of the conspiracy-minded that something coordinated is going on, but locates the source of the problem not in a shadowy cabal, but in the metaphysical, what Paul calls the machine, and Mary calls fully automated luxury Gnosticism.
That's a great line. Fully automated luxury Gnosticism. That's a great line.
I think this is inching towards a synthesis position. And what's more powerful is the way that they both deliver their message with wit, intelligence, and depth, and with none of the reactivity and anger that characterizes so much of this debate. So I really do think this is a step forward, and I'm looking forward to hosting them again in dialogue. Along with
Okay. Now, part of what was interesting about the Yarvin conversation, which I had never really thought in these terms, is that the American system of government sort of has monarchy, representative democracy, and oligarchy all embedded within its three branches of government. You have an executive, you have the Congress, and then you have the oligarchs on the Supreme Court. And so his talk about monarchy at the end of the video I found particularly interesting, especially in the light of, well, all of this anxiety about the machine.
Yes. Hello, Mr. Yarvin. I have a question. Maybe it's a monarchy 101 kind of question. I'm wondering, so the example you use when I've heard you speak is like the example of like a corporation. But when I think of a corporation, they have CEOs and they have like COOs and CFOs and boards of directors. What makes you call yourself like a monarchist? Like, what's the importance of having like a single king or a single monarch? Like, is it?
Well, I mean, a CEO and a king are the same thing, right? The king is the CEO of the state. I think actually, Nayib Bukele of
now, yes and no, but interesting nevertheless.
El Salvador was switching his Twitter description between president of El Salvador, dictator of El Salvador, CEO of El Salvador, and the only sort of difference in these organizational structures is that a monarchy is sort of a first level structure. There's nothing sort of enforcing. It has to enforce itself, whereas the bylaws of a corporation and the fact that the CEO is in charge of the corporate assets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the board chooses the CEO, all of these are enforced by a higher level of sovereignty. And so if you're trying to sort of mimic something like that in the sense of like the private, if you're trying to sort of mimic one of these private sector type designs where this order is enforced by a higher level sovereignty, and you're trying to make it like actually sovereign, then you're doing something. You have to modify that design somewhat. If you go to I should pimp my graymirror.substack.com, you'll see one of the posts toward the top is called something like optimal autonomous organizations, where I kind of describe this this model both in the sense of a sovereign monarchy and in the sense of a DAO, that as they do on Web3, as it's called. So it's actually, it's like, to me, it's not that different. It's somewhat different, but it's not that different. And the sense in which basically, if you imagine, I mean, here in Silicon Valley, we do a lot of sort of two in the box CEOs. We have a lot of co-founder situations. And so I was a CEO, and then I was like, no, I don't want to be CEO. I want to be CTO. And I basically ran a company with my co-founder for about 5 years, and which is very like a marriage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can imagine doing that with one person. I can imagine doing it with two people. I can maybe imagine it doing it with three. Three means you can take a vote, which is cool, the old triumvirate style. If you imagine trying to run a company in any kind of oligarchic or democratic fashion, it's like the example I came up with is, imagine the Chipotle shareholders had to take a vote every time Chipotle wanted to introduce a new burrito flavor, right? And this is the way basically most DAOs in the glorious new world of Web3 work. And it's a shit show. And you would expect it to be a shit show. It's obviously a shit show. And this is like, because it's sort of new, like Web3 and stuff, it's a sort of new area of endeavor. There aren't really Web3 organizations that are trying to compete with Chipotle. But Chipotle, because it has a monarch, would kick their ass. And so you're basically seeing that sort of everything that works in the modern world, if you drive a car, it was made by a monarchy. Go to a restaurant, the restaurant is run as a monarchy. Go to a movie, the movie is directed by a director who's a monarch, and so you basically see that just in sort of a process manner, organizations that work tend to follow this very simple pyramid structure of like top-down delegated authority. And we would expect that to be the case in nations. That is in fact the case in nations. This is why basically 95, I don't know the actual number, the enormous preponderance of sovereign regimes historically have been monarchies. And so you're basically just like, is our system of government one that works so well and is like so comfortable to live under and so effective and so efficient that basically we think we've found some exception to this pattern? And I just look at the way things work and I'm just like, no, actually, if you look at the difference between the USPS and UPS, UPS is a monarchy and the Postal Service is not a monarchy, right? And so this is just a very simple organizational principle. And then your challenge is to make that monarchy sort of work as well. And, the term I like to use is accountable monarchy, which is essentially what the CEO system does. And the question of how you build an accountable monarchy in the at a sovereign level is an interesting question that hasn't entirely been solved yet. If you look at that OAO post, that's sort of my attempt at the best possible solution. Like I absolutely hate like relying on modern technology in any way, shape, or form, but actually the blockchain does kind of help with this, I think. And so there are some things that
now there's a lot that someone could pick at with this. I mean, does not the United Postal Service have a director, and is it a monarchy, and the way in which a contemporary public corporation is or isn't a monarchy? I mean, what exactly did Elon Musk just do in taking over Twitter? And will Twitter be a monarchy? And does this break the machine? And of course, what in fact rules the monarch? And to get into the ideas of a biblical monarchy, you have this idea, or an ancient monarchy, where the god, I mean, the monarch doesn't derive his powers from below. The monarch derives his powers from above. But then you can look at, well, is Putin a monarchy because there's one person over that? Is Xi a monarchy because there's one person over China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? There's a lot to say. But again, the comparing and contrasting here between these, David talks about the dissident left and the dissident right. There's going to have to be a whole lot more thinking and talking, and I would say praying, about what exactly is it that we are looking for and wanting to do. Because whereas you can sort of have, as is the point he made before with his gentile comment, you can sort of have a coalition of the against, But one does not rule a nation from the coalition of the against. One does not construct a productive, extended being moved by a spirit from the coalition of the against. And in fact, the things that rule the world, certainly there are human beings that you can point to and name, and structures that you can look at. There's that funny word again, structures. But they are in fact other spirits that are moving in the world. And it's in fact these spirits that we participate in. And it's that arena that we feel so meaningful that we participate in when we're retweeting or reposting or talking to our neighbor or drawing attention towards the God via the church service. So this is just the beginning, and I don't have a tremendous amount of time to devote to this today. But as we try to move into the question of what are we listening to, and where is this going, and how might this shake out? I mean, the heart of the Weinstein-Peugeot conversation is going to be about the fact that the agent and the arenic God and the agentic God are in fact going to have to come together. And that which changes the world is certainly something we participate in, but it's levels above any individual human being. So this is hopefully to get started at a group of videos that are going to start plucking away at this whole spate of videos that have come out in these last 3 weeks to maybe help us create a cultural cognitive language to figure out how to talk about these things. So this feels like a good arc for this video. And because I didn't have anything to release Monday morning. So this will come out Tuesday morning. And I know some of you, because Yarvin's a political character, will have things to say, but we shall see. One of the benefits of being reared in a religious structure is that politics, people say, well, religious people avoid politics because they're cowards. No. I remember having a conversation with someone who had a seat in the Minnesota legislature. He was also an elder in his church. And so I asked him, I said, what makes you more nervous, political conversations or religious conversations? Oh, religious conversations. Politics is far lower level than the religious. And he's absolutely right. So, yeah. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment.